this time, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Kerry and Erika Anderson. They are both natives of Beauregard Parish. Erika has a degree in music from Jackson College of Ministries and a degree in accounting from McNeese State University. She's also a certified public accountant. She's a graduate of the LSU Law Center and is now retired from the active practice of law. Kerry has a degree in political science and a minor in religious studies from LSU. He attended Princeton Theological Seminary and is a graduate of the LSU Law Center. Kerry served on the DeRidder City Council for 14 and a half years, and he has now served as district judge for the last 14 years. They have both been happily married for 31 years to each other. They're wonderful. They're both members of Grace Church, and they're active in numerous local educational, civic, and charitable organizations. They love to bike, hike, travel, and spend time with family and friends. And so we give a big welcome to Erika.
Thank you so much for having us today. I'm going to put a caveat, as we lawyers say, a caution. It was very hard to reduce this presentation to 30 or 40 minutes. I had over 600 pictures from just our week in Normandy, and so I hope that you'll be gracious. You are welcome to stop at any time, ask any questions. If you want us to clarify something, or you have a question about something, this is back and forth. Please feel free to interrupt us. But Kerry's got a quick story he wants to share before we start talking about Normandy that was on the front end of this trip.
So this trip was a total of about 2.5 weeks, and we started out in the Netherlands and Belgium on a bicycle trip. Then we went to England, then we went to Normandy, and then we went to Paris. Then we spent the last week with her family in Germany. But while we were in the Netherlands, one of the projects that we wanted to accomplish was to find out where Ella DeRidder was buried. Ilana was very helpful in providing some preliminary information. We actually found the cemetery where she was buried. We actually rode our bicycles there and walked and walked and walked. There was a computer program. We found someone that spoke a little bit of English. We don't speak any Dutch. And looked in the database and found where the grave was. So we went to where that location was on the map. Couldn't find Ella DeRidder's name anywhere. Walked and walked.
We even got people that were there visiting their loved ones' grave sites to try to help us. And it was getting dark.
And we ended up going back, and our troop group leaders, who were Dutch, made inquiries after we left to try and find out why we couldn't find Ella DeRidder's grave. Well, one of the things we discovered when we went to Germany is their cemeteries are unlike our cemeteries. You don't have a grave in perpetuity with a headstone for 200 years. It's 20, 30, 40 years, and then if you don't pay more money and re-up it, somebody else gets buried there. So we found Ella DeRidder's grave. The only thing is,
our family must not pay an extension.
They must have used all their money to finance the railroad to come to DeRidder, because her name is not on a headstone anymore. And in fact, for example, like I say, in Germany, where Erika's family is buried, there's about a 4x8 family Fritz and Schaap plot, and generation after generation goes in that same plot. So it's not.
It's a different concept of how we view cemeteries here in the U.S.
Much more limited land.
So, I have a question, and they didn't pay
I don't know
whatever
exactly
it is, but did they just dump people on top of her? Or they took her out? Or?
I don't know all of the details. I would assume, depending on the amount of time. And,
or how they were buried.
Yeah, I don't know if they put them in caskets, if they just buried them in the ground, they deteriorated and just became part of the dirt. I mean, the body would decomposed. And
it was a foreign concept to us. We're like, what? And that's why we couldn't find Ella DeRidder. So,
but we tried, I'm sorry.
Okay, I hope you can all see the screen.
Joe's got a question.
And so what year did she die?
Do you remember, Ilana?
I don't, I can check and have that for you, but it was,
I mean, last century, it was,
Yeah.
I mean, it was,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
well, she had a daughter, I think, that died, not too, I mean, it was maybe in the 50s.
But as I understood it, it's a rental fee, kind of like that you pay to this cemetery to continue keeping the grave just for that individual, which is just so different than we do here in the United States. We took this great adventure in May of 2019, just weeks before the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And of course, we have a deep personal connection to World War II because Kerry's father was injured in the sinking of his aircraft carrier off the Philippines. And even though Normandy was in the European theater on the other side of the war from the Pacific, we are significantly interested in all aspects of this conflict as my German grandfather, that you will see a picture of here, was taken prisoner of war by the Russians and never returned home to Germany. My grandmother later learned years through different POW soldiers that he had actually died in a Russian prison camp. So we were invested in this trip to Normandy. So we started our trip in Dover, England. These are the White Cliffs of Dover, which I have sung about for many years, and so I had to sing while I was there.
A shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will move again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see.
the significance of the song, which was popular during the war era, and the White Cliffs of Dover, was the pilots, both primarily British and some American, who flew bombing raids across the English Channel between 1940 and 1944 when D-Day occurred, was they knew that they were safe when they could see the White Cliffs of Dover returning home.
So,
And you can see the coast of France.
yeah, this is standing on the cliffs of Dover, and that's France. So you can see how close, there's a map we want to show you of how close it was, where so much...
And that's where the Germans thought that the Allies would invade, because it's the closest point between England and France is between Dover and Calais. And you see Dunkirk also there, the evacuation, if you may have seen the movie, of the British troops in 1940 to live to fight another day, so to speak.
But really, the interesting thing in Dover is this Dover Castle, which it has a history of its own. It's just, if you ever get a chance to go there, it's a fascinating place. And I'm wearing my souvenir from the castle today of the red poppies. This was my souvenir from the castle. But the interesting thing about this castle is there was a covert operations center, many levels underneath that thing. The castle was just kind of like a decoy. Where the British used to plan the rescue of Dunkirk, as well as what led to the success of D-Day. Now, as you'll remember, Dunkirk evacuated the British out of France, which actually allowed resources and time, about 4 years, for the planning of D-Day. It kind of all just works together, and seeing it there was just fascinating. You can see the next slide.
It's moving when you stand in the same location where Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain walked out of
Yeah.
75 years.
And you can go in all these levels. It's fascinating. It's so well preserved, but they would not let us take any pictures. So, but this is a map that shows you the different routes that were taken for D-Day. And so, let me preface what I'm going to say. We wanted to spend several days here and take our time, so we actually hired a private guide, and he was French. He was raised in Normandy. He had a degree from history. Because it's like any other place. There's so much to take in. Memorials are everywhere. You can be going down a country road and there'll be a memorial where someone got hurt or died. It's just so much to take in. So many museums and such significance that we needed to target and focus on what we wanted to see and do. And the other thing is it has become such a tourist mecca, tourist trap. And there's all kinds of fabricated museums of things that are not authentic. It's sad to say. So thankfully, we were able to have Jonathan because we really wanted to hone in on the specific things we were interested in and not get lost in all of the excess. So we wanted to take approximately the same route from England to France as our American troops did. So we took an overnight ferry from Portsmouth, England to Worcestersham, France, which is just north of Caen. Yes. And
again, this map shows the actual D-Day invasion routes of the various troops. Everybody from the German side at least thought that it was going to occur here at the narrowest point, but it actually happened here at the longest distance across the English Channel.
So we wanted to take an overnight ferry, and we wanted to see, just like our troops did, at break of dawn, we wanted to see the shoreline. So we took this ferry and had some very small cabins. But we went, and when we got to...
it was about a 10-hour ferry ride, and so you didn't sleep much, but at least you had a bed to lay on if you wanted to.
So, but we kind of stayed in Bayou, which this was a charming old, come to find out, house and barn connected. They had renovated, and so that was where we stayed. It kind of was our central location. And we were in one of those top rooms, and it was so cool. You open the window, and you can see the whole town out. So the interesting thing about Bayou is that it is mostly preserved. It was not obliterated in the bombings of D-Day because it was quickly captured and used as an intelligence center for a lot of the taking of Normandy. And so most of the buildings in the town are in their original condition, well preserved. And the fascinating thing is the original church of Notre Dame is completely intact like it was in 1944. Whereas most churches in that region were drastically either completely destroyed or had to be rebuilt in some part. So it was a lovely small town, and as they say, all roads lead to Rome. It still had the old Roman wall, very well intact, and the widest Roman wall we saw when we were over there in Europe. Now,
if you tour Europe or England, every town you go to, they're going to point out to you the old Roman wall, which predates everything else typically in those communities. But every old town has some old Roman wall structure.
And there's a lot to do in this small town. I'm sure you've heard of the Bayou Tapestry, which is the history of the region. They wouldn't let us take pictures, but it was fascinating to go see that thing. And the food was incredible. Well, we told Jonathan, we want to go eat where you eat. Don't take us where the tourists go. We want to go where you go. So he said, okay, they're not going to have any English menus. And we're like, okay, you order for us, but everything had cheese. So we ate well. And of course, every morning, all the bakeries had the fresh baguettes for only €1. So we ate well and stayed in Bayou the entire time we were in Normandy. So Normandy is a beautiful countryside. It's lush, green, has beautiful trees, hedgerows, which I want to point out, you know, these were those things that was so difficult for our troops to get through. They are just walls, solid walls of branches, but that's the perimeter of their properties, and they are still using hedgerows. Then also, this is a picture of the ditches. You know, you hear the stories where the tanks had such trouble because the ditches were so deep. I mean, it's how they have it today as well. Normandy is known for excellent cheeses, apple cider, and seafood. all of which we enjoyed. Tourism, of course, is one of their largest industries with a large number of bed and breakfasts, but thankfully they have not gone to commercial chain hotels. Everything is still real local. It's very peaceful, and it's very hard to fathom that all the violence and bloodshed that took place there 78 years ago in this beautiful, peaceful place. The interesting thing, like I noted before, is there are memorials everywhere. Any dirt road you take, in a major intersection, a dirt road, there are memorials for people who, and not just for Americans, for British and Canadians and the other allies that helped us. They're everywhere, everywhere. Any farm road in the middle of a cow pasture, there may be a memorial. They are everywhere. And the war is still very much a part of everyday life in Normandy. This was an interesting picture. This was an old airstrip in Normandy, our guide pointed out to us. And everything that was left by the troops, the local people just put to use, making fences out of. This is metal from the old runway tracks. So pieces of the war were used for practical purposes by all the people, all the Normans.
And still being used 75 years later.
Yes. So our primary interest was to see the beaches and the cemeteries. That was the two most important things to us. So this is a map of the beach, and so many people think the beach is one beach, which is kind of what you think of when you see, Saving Private Ryan. But the beach is actually 50 to 60 miles long, and it was split into several zones. And you can see there were 5 zones: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Soar. And the Americans were assigned Utah and Omaha. So that is the area that we were most interested in. Omaha is about 6 miles long, and Utah is about 3 miles long. And interestingly enough, the names for those beaches were chosen by a general just asked 2 of its NCOs, "Where are you boys from?" And that's how Utah and Omaha got its name. We first went to Omaha Beach. We first went to Utah Beach. And this is the memorial for the Higgins boats, which was interesting to us because they were made in New Orleans. And if you've ever been to the World War II Museum there, they've got a wonderful exhibit on the Higgins boat. So this is right outside of Utah Beach. The day we went, it was very windy, and the sand at that beach is like powder, like white powder. It was everywhere. And
I think I still have some sand in my jacket pockets. And it was very chilly too.
But the interesting thing to go, because these are like places of reverence and honor for us, the stark reality was these are beaches just like here in America. There were tourist destinations. There were people swimming and playing in the sand and running and horse training. So it was just, we expected it to just be a place of honor because so many people died there. But it's used just like a normal beach would be here in the U.S. Of course, the interesting thing about Utah is that because of the weather, they overshot their destination. And then the early morning raids, they couldn't see the smoke. So they overtook the Utah beach in less than an hour. It was the easiest beach to capture with the least amount of casualties because the Germans had not prepared heavy defenses at Utah. But on that 3-mile beach, at the end of the day, on Utah, 1,700 vehicles entered the country that way, and 23,000 American troops on 3 miles. So the interesting thing is all of the leftovers that are still there. This is a massive concrete. They would drop them in the water to build like a port, like a driveway from where they were unloading vehicles.
Pumped them full of air, floated them across the English Channel or towed them, and then when they got there they would replace the air with water, and they would sink partially into the surf, and they would create a port, so to speak, with pre-made concrete pad, huge pad. That pad is probably 6 feet tall, and big giant pontoons, so to speak. But once they got them there, they took the air out and sunk them, because that's how they landed all the tanks and the jeeps to get them from offshore. Onshore, as they created literally these ports.
Now, the bunkers are everywhere throughout Normandy, but especially so on the beaches. But you can see this wall, the width of this wall. I mean, people play on them, kids are playing in them, but that's me at the top of one of them. They're everywhere. There are hundreds of these bunker concrete buildings all along the shores between Omaha all the way to Point de Hoc. And some of the original artillery things. This is inside one of them. And they had locks on the outside of the doors, not the inside, where you would go in and lock it to stay safe. The locks were on the outside. So our guy was saying they probably got locked in there so they wouldn't get scared to leave and were forced to stay and fight. That was just, unbelievable. But there's, you can see that's a holster, for better word, for a big gun.
So that big artillery gun would have been placed on a turret in the middle of that bunker, and they could rotate it to shoot probably as much as 10, 20 miles offshore. The thing that is said that probably saved us and made us victorious is the Germans had not really fully developed rebar and reinforced concrete yet. So like this bunker had the top blown off of it by a shell that hit it. Most of them were only partially destroyed, but if they had rebar reinforced concrete like they did at the end of the war, or we have routinely now, it could have been different, because those bunkers could have been virtually impenetrable at that time.
But the ground is just eat up with all this concrete. It's everywhere.
Again, that was one of those little turrets that they would turn the big artillery guns on.
Where would all that concrete come from?
They poured it right there. I mean, would have mixed it with probably sand from the beach, and
you got to think how much it's endured just for the Battle of Normandy, all the the shelling and the bombing, and then 80 years later, it's still there.
Well, and you have to remember, I mean, the British retreated in 1940 back across the English Channel, so the Germans had control of this from 1940 through June of 1944, so they had quite a while to build whatever they wanted to build, probably with French labor.
You can see from Utah, you can see Point de Hoc, which is the 90-foot cliffs that our rangers went up. And you can see how steep it is. This is a panoramic view where we're standing on Utah, and you can see Point de Hoc over there on the left. It's crazy to think that 225 guys just threw a flimsy ladder and rope, and they were just sitting ducks trying to get up those steep cliffs there. Of course, of the 225 rangers that took it, only 90 survived. That's Point de Hoc in the back. But you can see all the bullet holes, the charring of the wood in the top of the bunkers, and you can see the conduit for their communication lines was still intact.
So what the Americans would have done on a lot of those is they would have thrown a phosphorus grenade down into those bunkers. Again, the door was locked on the outside. The Germans couldn't get out. And so once the Americans were able to get over the initial threshold and get to the bunkers, the Germans inside were toast, literally.
These are those pillbox bunkers that gave them the panoramic view. Many of those.
This is a grappling hook that this is at the Point de Hoc Museum. That's what the Rangers would have thrown up over that cliff to latch on to something to secure the rope ladder or a rope to try to climb up those cliffs. That's an actual grappling hook from D-Day.
But of course, Omaha was the bloodiest D-Day beach, and roughly 2,400 U.S. troops either perished or were wounded or missing. And basically, we were sitting ducks because we underestimated the number of German soldiers that were in that particular area. Before the landing of the troops, you had all the raids by the British and airborne divisions, bombing and raiding, and they were unable to knock out a lot of the strong defenses of Omaha. The distinguishing thing for me between Omaha and Utah is just eat up with all those old bunkers everywhere, all that concrete. So much of Omaha, it's a residential area today. This is an original bridge type thing that is still there, that's as you're going to Omaha, that's on the property there. But the interesting thing, and these are some houses that were left intact, and they were used as officers' quarters and offices while the initial raids were going on. But they're still intact, those 3 homes there.
And these would have been right off the beach. Then there would have been homes there in 1944.
Mm-hmm. So this is Omaha Beach. It's a different color and a totally different feel. Utah's very elevated. You're up looking over the water at Point de Hoc. In Omaha, the beach is down here and the residences are more elevated.
That's where they took all the sand from.
This is the memorial. It's a good little drive to drive between the two to get from one to the other. But the interesting thing is there is live landmines and sea mines that are found every year continually in Europe, and especially in Normandy. And this is the picture of the first American cemetery right off of Omaha Beach right there. But our guide was an avid surfer, and he would say when he goes out surfing, he always can see things down in the water, pieces of equipment or parts of old tanks. And interestingly enough, I think 2 weeks before we went, somebody had found a rare handgun from the war. They dug it up or something. And the sad thing is, someone bought it instantly for gobs of money, rather than it being preserved for our history. But that's the business of war that goes on. But you can see lots of houses, people enjoying the beach. But
those houses would have been there in 1944. So the German defenses, machine gunners would have been, and the reason why so many people died in Omaha is because the German machine gunners, and we'll see a picture in a second, that it's sort of like a U where you go into the beach, but it's surrounded by this high cliff, not necessarily as high as Point de Hoc, but the Americans, these were all machine gun nests, and so when the Americans were coming ashore, they're just target practice. This is a better picture of one of those concrete pads that was not quite as decayed as the other one you saw.
But it's just part of the landscape there. This is a church right off of Omaha Beach, and the white picture in front of the church shows what it looked like the day of the invasion. It was completely destroyed, and how they built it back. But because we had Jonathan as our tour guide, he called one of his farmer friends who owned the property that let us go up north and closer to another one of the beaches that British took. And just in this farmland, way above there's still all of these structures where any, manned and unmanned for artillery. It was just so fortified, and all that stuff has remained this far down the road after all of that.
So this is Omaha Beach down here, and obviously this vegetation would have not been there in 1944, but each one of these little locations would have been a machine gun nest, and then there were access to those machine gun nests, and then tunnels that ran below the ground level between each nest, sort of a spider ant network of tunnels where the troops could go from one to another without being above ground or be exposed to gunfire. And again, you're at an elevated position here of 60, 70, 80 feet above the beach level
shots of
Oh,
that.
wow.
It's a beautiful beach today. But these bunkers, this is Jonathan, our guide at the top of one of them, are just kids' playgrounds. When tourists go to the beach.
How long did the Germans take to prepare all of this?
From 1940 to 1944.
Before it, yeah, I would imagine it took that long
Right.
to build all those
Right.
bunkers and things.
There are 26 military cemeteries representing all nations across Normandy, but most famous, of course, is our American cemetery. And every country, we learned, is responsible for the upkeep of their cemetery in Normandy. And you will all be quite proud of how we maintain ours. Of course, ours is the jewel of Normandy, we think. But in stark contrast to the grandeur of our country cemetery is one of the German cemeteries that we visited. There are multiple German cemeteries, but this is the largest one, where the ages of the dead are from 16 to 72. Most of the graves in this German cemetery have multiple bodies, as it is only a few acres, and 20,000 men are buried in this few acres.
Usually four soldiers to a grave.
Right. And so their names are just multiple names are listed on these stones that are on the ground. And the sign in front of the cemetery, which interestingly enough, this was an American cemetery until 1947. The sign on the front says, the remains were exhumed, in 1947, this was an American cemetery. The remains were exhumed and shipped to the United States. It has been German since 1948 and contains over 21,000 graves. With its melancholy rigor, it is a graveyard for soldiers, not all of whom had chosen either the cause or the fight. They too have found rest in our soil in France. The Normandy American Cemetery, though, is actually a U.S. territory inside France. The cemetery site has a half-mile access road and covers about 172 acres and contains the graves of 9,386 of our military dead, most of whom lost their lives on D-Day and the ensuing operations. The cemetery is very large. Has anyone been to the Normandy Cemetery?
My parents did.
Mm-hmm.
My
It is-
dad said there wasn't a blade of grass out of place.
No,
It was
it's
the most
immaculate.
immaculate place he'd ever seen.
That was our impression.
And it was very somber. There was
very.
no extra noise,
Right.
there was no chit chat, it was very somber.
The size of it, because we visited the German cemetery first, and just comparing in contrast that small acreage for 21,000 men, and we have 173 acres for less than 10,000. It is just massive. But the buildings are immaculate and perfectly maintained. The atmosphere,
It sits on the hill above Omaha Beach.
yeah.
And the original cemetery, like the one little grave that was still there, the original cemetery where most of the dead from D-Day were buried was at the edge of the beach. And then only after the cemetery was developed did they move those graves to this cemetery.
But like Laura said, the atmosphere is very reverent, mostly quiet, and not the usual chatter of most tourist attractions, and there's just an overwhelming sense of the loss that happened.
From the cemetery, you can still see remnants of the war buried in the sand down on the beach.
Mhm.
I have a question about the upkeep of these various areas, like the cemeteries and the monumental areas. Is that just Normandy's?
The American cemetery is upkept by you, American taxpayers.
Right, because it's a U.S. territory inside France, so we are responsible for it. But the sad thing is the other cemeteries do not have the care that they should be given, in my opinion. You know, a lot of it is based on volunteer help. They don't have funds to keep it up. And so it's sad, but it is what it is. But in Normandy, each country is responsible for their own cemeteries.
The memorial and museums would have been, they're their own,
Yeah.
take care of their own, either entrance fees or if it's a government-owned, but not American-owned.
Right. Beautiful monuments and buildings around the property. And the interesting thing is there's no difference in rank. Generals are buried next to privates. The only preference given to being where you want someone buried is if they are family. So this is the story of two brothers that died on the same day. And there was someone already buried next to one, and this is like one of the only exceptions, and they exhumed the body of the soldier that was buried here, and so that the two brothers could be side by side.
The second brother's body was not found and identified, or remnants of that soldier's body were not found and identified until 40, 50 years later. So.
Yeah, they told, the American servicemen that gave us our tour told us that originally they tried to put all family members together
Right.
as the exhumations occurred.
But other than family members, there's no difference in rank in how they're buried.
And there's still thousands of American soldiers that are unaccounted for from Normandy, the Battle of Normandy. It's lasted for several months. It wasn't just one day. The beaches were pretty much over in a few days, but the whole campaign.
There were hundreds of people there the day we were there, but because it's such a big place and the sidewalks are so wide, it felt very private just being there. But this was interesting. As you exit the back of the cemetery, they have these solid concrete fences and have the names of all the missing and unaccounted for. Moving on to museums, we only visited 2 museums while we were there. Now there are countless museums there, and it would be hard to pick and choose. You just couldn't do it all unless you were there for a couple of months. But our guide suggested we visit the Airborne Museum as well as the Point de Hoc Museum, which we did. Now this is a memorial for the paratroopers out in the field. This is a famous bridge that they took, and you can see that it's just beautiful farmland now. And the interesting thing about it, which we'll circle back, this is the Airborne Museum here, and then you can see the church.
St. Mary Blaze.
And I don't know if y'all heard the story of the paratrooper that got caught on the top of the church. They have there yes.
It was also the scene in the movie The Longest Day.
Yeah. The interesting
It's a
thing.
true story.
Yeah.
John Steele was his name.
Yeah. The next slide too. This is a bridge that was built to access roads, and it's still there. It's still being used as a bridge near the paratrooper part of the Normandy that's dedicated to them. Their memorial, like I said, in the country. They've got a museum in town, but their memorial out in the country. And because we were there just a few weeks before the big celebration, you can see the bridge there, they had all these teams kind of sweeping the property for security. I guess the vice president or someone from the U.S. was going to, of importance was going there. So
the president actually went for the 75th anniversary, I believe, of the day.
Right, but I don't know who went to that actually. There were so many celebrations over that week. So, but it's just beautiful farmland now, and where thousands of paratroopers landed the morning of D-Day. And then you can see their museum looks like a chute. Yeah. The interesting thing about the paratroopers that we didn't think about when we're going through their museum is they were so weighted down with so much equipment. I mean, a lot of the men just cut it off before they ever jumped out of the plane. And then a lot of them just lost it, hitting the ground. And many of them died or got killed just, winding up the trees. It was dark. They weren't, they didn't have the navigation stuff that we have today. But that, if you ever go to Normandy, you definitely want to do the Airborne Museum. Every detail of a paratrooper's time in Normandy is documented. Every exhibit, everything they could have worn, had on their being. They used a lot of these glider planes that had no motors. They would shoot out of a regular plane, and 2 men would man it down so that nobody would detect them. All that's on display in that museum. It's fantastic. Fantastic. The next slide I'm going to show you is, let's see. The next slide is the enormity of D-Day in general. By the numbers, our numbers, the British numbers, the Canadian numbers, the Allied numbers. The average age of an American soldier on D-Day was just 26. And the sad thing, as the war went on and more manpower was needed, nearly half of all American troops were just teenagers. And of course, the Allies lost 11% of their troops in the Battle for Normandy and sent over 2 million Allied troops into Normandy.
The numbers there, if you can't see them, is 156,000 troops, 73,000 Americans, 62,000 British, and 21,000 Canadians, 6,939 ships, 11,590 planes.
But the biggest loser, we realized when we were there, were the French civilians that people don't think about. They suffered the most casualties of anyone. It's estimated that around 20,000 men, women, children were just collateral damage in all of the bombing and mutilation of war. But from our visit, our general consensus from the French were that they were very happy we Americans came, as they say, with our chewing gum and chocolate. And we found the French people that we interacted with to be very warm. Now, they're very direct. When they say something, they say what they mean. They don't beat around the bush. But we had a wonderful experience. And I was really glad we got to see it from someone else's perspective. Jonathan grew up there, and he learned the history through the French school system, which his story sometimes was always a little different than what we had been taught. But it was just neat to get a different perspective on such a world-changing conflict.
Any questions?
I do. Well, you know I would.
I wouldn't expect less.
No, and wonderful program, Eric and Kerry.
Thank you.
I made a couple of notes when you were talking. Over in Maryville, I don't think it was D-Day, but it was in November, I'm not sure what year. The McPherson brothers from Maryville, both were killed in France within 30 days of one another. McPherson, McPherson. And the cemeteries, Kerry and Eric, it's my understanding that you had the option, the family after the war, to bring the body home or leave it.
Right.
So right here in Beauregard, you see somebody that was killed local, someone was still over there. I think that's right.
That's right.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's
And,
right.
And like the slide about the German cemetery, that was an American cemetery until 1947. When they exhumed those bodies, they gave them the option of burying them in the American cemetery or bringing them back, and many chose the option to bring them back.
And, you know, we were, when Linda and I were over in Holland a few years ago at Nijmegen, and this city, there was just absolutely terrible bombing in the city, and the Germans and that time. And one of the people we got to know, his uncle and his grandmother were killed, and one of the children of the bombing. And where Nijmegen is, you're less than 10, 15 miles from the German line. I mean, you're right there. And so today it's open borders, and people just come and go. And so I asked him, I said, this is a guy from Holland, and I said, what do you think of the Germans today? He used two words, long gone. Long gone. And I think Lydia's dad, Lindsay, it may not have been D-Day 1, 2, which was 3. Her dad was at D-Day, which one, Lydia?
Omaha Beach. Was interesting that my dad was in his late 80s before he would tell us about the drama of Omaha Beach. But one of the problems that our American troops and all of the troops had on all of these beaches, there was not supposed to be the resistance to meet them from the Germans that occurred because our air defense, the weather had been very, very bad, and when they took off and the parachute, they were off track. They were in the wrong place when they deployed from their aircraft. And they landed miles and miles and miles away from where they were supposed to be, so they did not get to the Germans like they would have ordinarily to take out a lot of the resistance. There were hundreds of ships. I don't know about the other beaches, but my dad was under the command of General George Patton. And the ships, as they came into Omaha Beach to approach, there were so many of them, it was kind of a crapshoot as to which ones were in the front and which ones were in the back. And Daddy said it was just a log jam of ships, if you can imagine, hundreds on this 5-mile area trying to get in. And the first group, of course, that went in were the ones that so many casualties occurred from. And my dad just happened, the ship he was on sat in the harbor for 2 days listening to the going on and the mass war on the beach. And he said everybody on his ship was so sick and so scared and so nervous that everybody was throwing up. He said it was terrible sitting out there in the water on your ship waiting to go in. And of course they were getting radio reports of the trauma on the beach and how much worse it was than what they expected it to be. It was supposed to take less than a day to secure Omaha Beach, and it took 5 or 6 days before you could safely exit your ship. And my dad exited on a Higgins boat on day 3, early morning of day 3. And they were in the process of clearing the beach of casualties and all of these, just everything all over the beach, the jeeps, the tanks, everything they were trying to get out there. And he said it took him about a half a day to get from the water. Water, he said, was up to his neck and it was cold. And a lot of the boys couldn't swim. And a lot of them drowned and trying to, because the water, it was very rough. And, so it was a very traumatic experience. And my dad was in his early 80s, I guess. My daughter married a young man who was in the military and stationed in Germany. So Mother and Dad went to Germany to visit them, and Mark was able to take them to Normandy and to Paris and all of the places that my dad went with George Patton. And so they were able to go back to Omaha Beach. And you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, of how it starts at the cemetery. Well, my dad walked out on the beach all by himself, and my daughter said he was out there about 30 minutes on his hands and knees at the edge of the water. It was so emotional, he couldn't have come back. And so it was a very difficult time. That's been on my bucket list to go. I just haven't gotten there yet.
And the crazy thing is it's a beautiful place. It's beautiful. It's hard to fathom that violence. But I really believe, just personally, of course they had no GPS, nothing like we have today. It's a wonder it came together like it did. You know, no cell phones, no tech, you know.
The author was to the point, he was discussing withdrawing, not surrendering, but withdrawing because it was such a.
But I think if the people who hit Omaha, they were off track, their mark was closer to, the crews that hit Utah, their targets were closer to Omaha. And it would have turned out differently, or could have turned out differently. But yeah, it was bad weather, the bombing raids did not go as planned, and so I can't imagine the mass confusion and trauma.
Did you all go down into Belgium any at all while you were there?
A little bit. When we left the Netherlands, we went through Belgium to, yeah.
Well, one of my friends and I were there in Belgium overnight, and we went to this area where the parachute troops had landed. It was just above a river, and I don't remember the name of the river, but it was laden with nothing but crosses. It was just covered with white crosses. And that was the most impressive thing that I saw as a remnant of this war.
There are military cemeteries all over Europe, from World War I and World War II.
I think Erica mentioned the gliders that came in, the American gliders.
But they'd shoot these gliders out, and these poor airborne guys in those gliders, I mean, they had those things had no motors on them, no maneuvering equipment, and they were confined. And those things, more of those I think wrecked and got to where they were supposed to, but it was, the Airborne Museum was fascinating. From what they carried in food, those guys were carrying 120 pounds when they got off those planes. I mean, they just had to shed weight.
Yeah. The Germans had a little surprise for us with the gliders in certain areas. And they put these telephone poles up.
Oh.
So here comes the glider, and you can't steer the thing.
You can't steer them.
So you go right into the...
Harry, do you remember where Mr. Gibson parachuted?
Mr.
In
Ray.
France or Germany?
Vincent, do you remember where did Ray crash? I think he was in
Philippines, wasn't
Bill?
It was in France.
It was in France. I thought he was in the Pacific.
Oh, no. It was in Europe.
No.
He was in a German POW camp, but I don't know if he went down in Germany or in France. I think it was France.
I think it was France.
But I don't know if he was in a German POW camp in France or if he was taken back to Germany to a POW camp.
And they moved him around as Hitler was trying to negotiate more favorable peace treaty, and he had all these airmen, and they kept moving them because they knew the Russians and the Americans were trying to catch up to them. The last place that Ray was at, Kerry, I can mispronounce it, Stalag, whatever, but it was about 5,000 of these airmen behind this big fence. Here comes Patton's tanks coming up to the fence. Ray told this story. And it was hard to get Ray to tell the story. It took him years, like Lee said about
his
the
dad.
But it's the same thing with Perry. They wouldn't talk about it until the latter part of the life. But this tank comes up, a bunch of tanks, and here are these men behind this fence. This guy gets out of the tank and he's got this what looks like a 1930 leather football helmet carry on, and he's got a cigar in his mouth, and he's standing on top of that tank, and he hollers over the fence with these hundreds of guys still behind the fence. He says, "Is there an O'Malley in here?" And somebody in the crowd says, "Yeah, he's down in building D." The guy takes the cigar out of his mouth and says, "Go get him. Tell him his brother's here to take him home."
Oh.
And he said, Ray told that story.
Well, about the landing craft and the PT boats and everything, a fellow by the name of Higgins in New Orleans is the one who designed and built these things.
And they have a wonderful display of some Higgins boats at the World War II Museum. If you've been once, you need to go back because they change out their exhibits It is just a fantastic place to go, but
If you haven't been to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, you
You
owe it
must
to yourself
go.
to go.
Absolutely.
It's wise.
And don't limit, you need to mark off a couple of days to go. Don't go and expect to go through it in 2 or 3 hours.
because it's a complex of buildings, it's not one building. And they are constantly have these traveling exhibits with interesting things. One of the exhibits they had last time we visited is how stateside, what was left that wasn't used for the war, what people did with it for fashion. You know, how they made dresses out of shower curtains and just, you know, interesting, cool things like
They
that.
had, mother made slips for us girls out of parachute.
Right, all these old parachutes were used in dresses and the fashion of the day. You know, couldn't have very many nylons, but all that had to go to the war effort. And interesting things, how ladies would draw. It was just a fascinating exhibit outside of, you know, military things. So. Well, thank y'all so much for having us today.
Thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful program.
Thank y'all.